anybody'd like to go with me, I'll be leaving about probably a little after 2 o'clock. We'll be getting back just for the evening service, going down to Ocala. I'm going to go. I need somebody brave enough to go with me, if that makes sense. But that's what we are. I'm going to be going down to Ocala. I'd like to take your minds back. We are starting a series, or I have, on preaching the New Testament, the New Testament and the Old Testament, if that makes sense. So many things that we read of and brought out in the New Testament is in the Old Testament. Many of the men and women that are mentioned in the Old Testament, or talked about in the Old Testament, is again mentioned in the New Testament. So we know, as Paul said in Romans, said the things that are written aforehand was written for our learning. We know that. Looking at the book of Romans tells us that they was written for our learning. Last week we looked at, of course, we looked at the man Enoch, who did not die but walked with God. We're going to keep talking about his family. His family is very interesting. Enoch did not die. God took him. We look at this. It says that in Hebrews 11, he's mentioned. He's here. He walked God. He walked with God. We can see that God has a place for us. He loved that man so much that he took that man straight to heaven to be with him. I think we can see how great he was. But, you know, I have heard I've heard it said that we are a direct from our parents, from our father or our mother. And everything that we are, good or bad, is because of them. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. In Ezekiel 18, there in the first part, it talks out a long say-so of that. It says, the soul that sinneth, it shall surely die. The soul that sinneth. As I worked in the prison, I had to deal so often times with men coming in, and they was in prison, they wanted to blame their daddy or their mama for them being in prison. And it wasn't that. They was in prison because of what they had done. I say this because we have a man that walked with God. Then we have his father, basically, or his son was Methuselah, the oldest man that ever lived. Then he had a son, and then he had a son, basically that was, we know, to be Noah. Noah. You know, you may not have heard of all the rest of them in the list of the genealogy, but how many of you have heard of Noah? Everybody in here have heard of Noah? If you haven't, you probably heard my wife. Every weekend or two a month, you hear her holler at the house, Noah. She likes to holler Noah a lot. We have a grandson named Noah. A lot of people, they name their kids. I know that's very common today to have the name Noah. And I think that's great. Because Noah was a man that knew God. Matter of fact, we're going to, if we would, at Genesis. I want you to look here, Genesis chapter 6. It says, and it came to pass, when man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters was born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all those whom they chose. And we can see, somebody said, who's the daughter of men and the daughter of God? A lot of people look and say, well, that's talking about angels. No, angels were spiritual beings. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about those people that had followed the tradition and teaching of Abel, and those people that was following Cain's life. There was godly men, and there was a godly family, there was an ungodly family. One that rebelled against God, one that walked with God. Abel was of that family that walked with God. But before long we can see that they started all of a sudden deciding that it was okay to associate together. look back later, we look at the time of Noah, they was told not to marry those of the wicked world. We look at Nehemiah and Ezra there at the time of the temple building, and they said this is brought on, and they saw the sin of the people that they was taking foreign wives. Even in the New Testament, it says that be not unequally yoked together with non-believers. Some have taken this to teach marriage. I think it's talking about everything. I think it's talking about business. Don't get in a business where you have to listen and the ungodly person can control what you do or what you do not do. We cannot do that. I lost a job one time because I would not lie for the person in charge and over me. They looked at me and said, "Carter, you too good to be in that position." And I said, "Well, I'm not in that position no more." And I stepped down. Because we are to not be unequally yoked. But here we can see it happened. And because of this, something happened, and that is the sin came into them. In verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of the heart was only evil continuously. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both men and beasts, and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I've made them. But, he said, but what? But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He found grace. Unmerited favor. Noah wasn't good enough to not be condemned, but he found grace. Why did he find grace? It says, verse 9, this is the generation of Noah. Noah was a just man. He was what? He was a just man, perfect in his generation. Not perfect, but compared to everybody else, he was what? Perfect. They wasn't just. And it says, and then what is it? The nail on the head there is this. He said this, Noah walked with God. He did what? He walked with God. He was like his great-grandfather who had walked with what? Walked with God. A Christian is not someone that obeyed the Lord. It's somebody that obeyed the Lord and then walks with Him. We have people today that think, well, I'm a Christian, so I can do whatever I want. No. If we are a Christian, we have to walk. In prison, they used to have this. They said, what we have to do, we have to be people that not only are we talking the talk, but we also got to what? Walk the walk. And I believe that would be the name of this sermon almost. The last two. Men of old that walked with God. And Noah begot 3 sons. And we see them, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it said, and the earth was full of violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, but all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh should come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. It said, through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of what? Of gopher wood. Somebody said, can you tell me what gopher wood is, or what it was? And I can honestly tell you no.
I think it's chestnut.
But you know, the fact, well, I've heard chestnut, I've heard 3 different woods that people was positive it was. But the thing about it is, I don't care. I wasn't told to build it. Noah was told to build it, and he knew what it was, right? It don't matter what it was, and I don't know what it was, and it's not important to me to know what it was. But the important thing is, Noah knew what it was, and he used what God told him to use. And he built that ark. And by the way, just a little bit of a fact here that I think is so neat to some people that don't believe that God's word is inspired. In the 1860s, this is history of man, when they started deciding, before the 1860s, all ship was made out of wood. They had got wood to the point that, you know, they had wood so thick and so strong that a cannonball would bounce off of it. Did you know that? But then they came up with exploding shells, and shells as projectile, and all of a sudden, guess what would happen? The wooden ship, a gun could destroy. The strongest would. So they decided what they was going to do. They was going to put steel on it. So they made the steel and they fabricated. They took the steel and they put it on the ships. Isn't that great? Wasn't it a great idea? Oh, I forgot to tell you. You know what the ship did when they did that? They sank. Because a wooden ship would float. But then they finally came up. And if you look at the ships that we can see in the drawings of the 1860s, the American Civil War, you can see all those ships, no matter what side, they look a lot the same. Because finally they found out a way to make a steel ship that would float. It was the dimensions they had to have. They finally figured out if it was 300 by 50 by 30, it would float. Isn't that something? That's the dimension they do. And they found out they could, if you go down and you see the barges along the ocean, if you see the barges on the Mississippi, you look at those barges, they fill them just plumb full of coal or lime rock or whatever, and they float. But they made out of steel. But the dimension is 300 by 50 by 30. And people said, well, that's cubic. How big is a cubic? Again, I don't know. Some have said a cubic is from elbow to the fingertips. Some people said, well, it's from here to here. Some people said, no, it's from here to here. I don't know, but it don't matter. I don't know what a cubic was at the time of Noah, but he did. Right? He did. And by the way, the dimensions was what was important. If they use in modern ships, if they use a yardstick, or if they use a foot, or whatever, as long as it's 300 by 50 by what? You're probably going to go home, Bobby, and build a ship just to see if it works. I know, Bobby. Bobby, you go home and you get your welded cut torch and you build one. I want to see if it works, okay? Build one big enough for somebody here to ride in, because I want to see if they hold the load or not. That was what I'm doing. But we can see what happened. Well, Noah, he lived in the midst of a generation that half the people had been God-fearing people. But then, all of a sudden, it got to the point and got wicked. Now, we look at how long they lived, and that was hundreds of years. Matter of fact, Methuselah died when he was over 989 years old. And Methuselah, by the way, in college one time, I drew up a chart. Found out they had one at the bookstore, but I didn't know it. I did a chart of when everybody died. Do you know what year Methuselah died? The year of the flood. He died the year of the flood. I didn't say he died in the flood, but I'm not saying he didn't. He died the year of the flood. So it was. But when he started, he had knew some righteous people. But Methuselah fascinates me because he was a man that lived and knew righteous people. But I don't think he was righteous, because God came to Noah and Noah preached for 100 years before the flood. So 100 years of Noah's preaching, Methuselah was alive, but he still didn't get in the boat. Today, we need to realize the generation around us, it will get wicked. And I'm not preaching doom and damnation of the world, because I think, I've only lived a short while. Somebody says, what? Well, okay, I've lived almost 70 years. But I think that America has become a little bit more wicked in that time. But I do know this, some countries in Africa that was eating people back when I was born are now studying God's Word. I do know there's more people in China that's listening and following the Bible today than there was 50 years ago. So there's good hope too. But we can realize we have to be those that obey. In Hebrews 5:11 and 7, we find that it says that he obeyed. What did he do? He obeyed God. And we must obey him. And 2 Peter 2 and 5, in 2 Peter 2 and 5, he is called the preacher of righteousness. The preacher of righteousness. Why was he that? Look at Genesis 6, and it says that he was in fellowship with God. Fellowship with God. Why? Oh, by the way, what is fellowship? What is fellowship? Can you have fellowship without being there? I have people that realize we'll have fellowship. Hey, let's have some fellowship. I enjoy having fellowship. I went by, and I tell you what, last night, giving somebody a ride home, I went by and I stopped. We're going by Bobby and Felicia. I saw him out there, so I went in, and we had fellowship, didn't we? And I'm proud. I sat down, and I'm so proud of them. I ate a little bit of food, and they didn't tell my wife. Did you hear? You see, understand? Fellowship is when we take the time to what? To be with one another. He had fellowship with God. Now, how are you going to have fellowship with God? Now, I don't know. I'm not talking about, how do we have fellowship? You talk to God. You pray. And you allow God to talk to you. How do you do that? You read God's Word. And then, of course, I think we have fellowship as a family when we meet together. Well, we as a family meet together and worship God Almighty. This is what we must do. We can realize in fellowship with God. And then I like in a thought that's taught in 1 Peter, and I got to mention that, 1 Peter 3 and 20. Where in the Old King James it says, like figure, wherein, that is, Noah and 8 souls was saved by, what was Noah saved by? Water. A lot of people said the ark. No, he wasn't saved by the ark, he was saved by water. By way of the ark. What did Noah need to be saved from? The same thing that God was trying to separate himself from. What did God wanted to leave? Somebody said, well, the earth. No, the sin that was on the earth. Noah, a righteous man, was saved from sin. The sinful world that was round about. If he would have got into that ark and stayed there for that year in that rain and came back out, and there would have not been a flood and the people were still alive, the sin would still be there. Right? And by the way, I think the same way is true today for us. Some people say we are saved by the church.